there's always been kind of, I think, a little bit of a misnomer by the popular media as to what evangelical means. It seems like if you own a Bible, you're evangelical sometimes for some of the pundits on the left. Can you kind of help us a little bit more, Darren, and understanding really what you're looking at and why you're looking at this specific research data?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, related to that is, that's how I got into this area or topic, because in 2016, when Trump kind of entered the Republican primaries, there was a ton of articles in mainstream media outlets saying, well, evangelicals are supporting Trump. And I was like, well, that's interesting, given some of his dynamics and his personality. And so I started looking into it, and I came to the early conclusion that it depends on how you define evangelical, and depends on how you measure it, because most of the people in my experience, and in a Southern California kind of setting, most evangelicals weren't at that point necessarily supporting Trump. I started digging into it, and so I published a few pieces highlighting that, well, actually 60 to 70% of evangelicals, as you measure them, weren't necessarily supporting him. They were supporting Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio or other folks like that. But there was a solid kind of 36% that were supporting him, which gets us to your original question, like, how are we measuring this? Well, scholars measure it in any number of ways historically. If you look at sociological research or historical research, they might go by denominations, like historical denominational things. So if you're a Southern Baptist, or you're a certain strain of Lutheranism or non-denomination, that's one way to measure it. Not probably the best way, because for a lot of reasons we won't get into. Another way academics have measured evangelicals is by a kind of a doctrinal, like 4 or 5 kind of doctrinal stances. And if you get good survey data on, do you believe in the authority of Scripture? Do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and rose from the dead? Do you believe in sharing your faith? Like, we'll go
That's
through all
George
of them.
Barna. George Barna has, I think, 7 or 8 criteria, because he, matter of fact, and to your point, it isn't necessarily only self-identification, because even many folks, if you ask them, are you evangelical? Some will say no, and they are, and some will say yes, and they're not. And so self-identification of just a simple question can actually lead you astray. So Barna used this criteria in his polling when he identifies evangelicals,
which is probably the best measure we have. But that brings us to the exit polls, which do not use any of those measures. The best that they have is self-identification, and depends on the polling. Sometimes they'll say, do you consider yourself a born-again Christian? And so anybody that says yes to that, they'll say, well, you're an evangelical, right? Mm-hmm. What I'm sure you can see where that measure may or may not is exactly what we were talking about, Lenny. Like, I could under or over report.
So there's a lot of folks in the AME church. Let's use as an example, the First African Methodist Episcopal Church, who would classify themselves as born again. They would not classify themselves as evangelical. Right. Sociologist David Bebbington came up when he published his book, The Evangelical Quadrilateral. He comes up with 4 ideas that he sees as encapsulating all of evangelicalism. They're people who hold to biblicism, a particular regard for the Bible. In other words, a high view of Scripture, that Scripture is basically God-breathed, that it's central to the cross. It's crucicentrism, focusing on Christ's atoning work. So if you hold to a high regard of the Bible, you focus on the atoning work of Christ, you believe that human beings need to be converted. There's a conversionism idea that you have to be saved in some sense. And then activism, if you're going to be evangelical, you have to evangelize. You have to spread the gospel. So belief in the Bible, focus on the cross, understanding that human beings need to be saved, and then that atonement needs to be shared. That was kind of Bebbington's kind of mere version of evangelicalism, which I think is fairly fair. I think that's a good understanding. I think a lot of folks would then, would be classified as such, even though, and this is the other portion of this is why self-identification I worry about, because the term evangelical has in the press taken on a negative connotation, and some people want to say, I'm not an evangelical, but I love Jesus. And so you get that kind of a tension, as you're saying, within this concept.